we've been doing over the last couple of weeks is looking at influences that have shaped us as individuals and shaped us as consumers. And it seems to me that in discussions in tutorials, most of us have become consumers quite early, sometimes through having pocket money, sort of a little bit of money that we have freedom over what we can purchase, or sometimes being able to go to school and making a purchase for lunch. This week, what I'm going to do is be talking about taste and class. And I'm going to introduce you to perhaps the foremost sociologist in this area. But I want you to bear in mind that when he was writing in a particular time and a particular place. So he was writing in the 1960s, 70s in France. And so I want to talk about his ideas as kind of a foundation for our discussions. But I want you to be thinking a lot about whether we can take his ideas and transplant them to Australia, is number one. And so do they have applicability to Australia? But then number two, do they have applicability now in Australia? Or is France just so unique and different that the ideas don't apply? The bloke is a Frenchman called Pierre Bourdieu, and I want to talk a little bit about him and then some key concepts of fields, habitus, reproduction and capital, things like cultural, economic and social capital, which is his metaphor for the resources that you can have in terms of money, but also in terms of the social networks you have and your access and ability to play some cultural games. Now, his ideas are really, really well summed up, I think, in Grayson Perry's documentary, which I don't have time to show you today, but there are links to that on YouTube. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that, because he's kind of doing Bourdieu's analysis, but he's doing it in contemporary England, so it's worthwhile having a look at that there. I'm not sure if he mentions Bourdieu. I'm not sure that he does, but I think that is the sort of analysis that he's doing. Bourdieu was born in 1930. He was, as I said, was looking at the 1960s, 1970s France. He did what's called an ethnography, which is, an ethnography means the study of a group, and he was looking at French people as a whole across different classes. I'm always interested in people's backgrounds. I've got a real penchant for biography, kind of curious about why people take up a particular interest. So in a way, when I found out that he came from quite a poor background or a very modest background and was the first in his family to university, he writes in several places about being uncomfortable, not really fitting in, even though he went to university via boarding school, which would have equipped him in some ways for university. It kind of made sense, some of the studies that he's been interested in then for the rest of his life. So in this ethnography, this study of a group of people, in this case, people living in Paris, he did a range of gathering of data. So he talked to people, he did some interviews, he also did some surveys. So a lot of his book, Distinction, contains a lot of empirical evidence for his theory. There are, however, criticisms of his work, and it seems in many ways, apart from class, the presentation of his book suggests that French people were quite an ethnic, homogenous group. And I don't think they were as diverse then as now, but I think that in terms of criticism, that's a valid one, that he wasn't looking at ethnicity, he was only looking at class, so he wasn't looking at intersections. He also doesn't tend to look at gender either. He does tend to focus on men. He comes from what's called a conflict perspective, which is based on Karl Marx's ideas, that people are in competition over resources, so he's interested in that. He thinks this idea of people having distinction, which I guess these days I might think of as having prestige, is a game. It's a social game. And some people, really his argument fundamentally is that some people are more equipped to play this game than other people. And because of that, and one of his interests at this time was, of course, that France had chopped off the heads of many of the aristocracy and had gone for an egalitarian culture. But what he noticed, or what he reckons was going on, was that there was a group of people at the top, and it seemed to be the same group of people at the top of the hierarchy in France. So he's got this idea that winners keep tending to win and losers keep tending to lose. And so the nuts and the bolts of it are that people learn how to play these cultural games, and they're the ones who end up being the winners over and over again. He reckons, I'll come back to this point a little bit later on, but he reckons that culture is a social agent. It actually has political implications. And if there's one thing that I want you to take away from today, is the whole idea about culture and politics being entwined, that they're not separate at all. So when you come here to do politics, it feels as if it's an entirely different discipline to doing anthropology or sociology. Bourdieu says, nah, it's all intertwined. What is considered legitimate culture, or culture that we should be interested in, he reckons is actually closely associated with entitlement and privilege. So if you're engaged in any illegitimate cultural activities, then you're pushed to the outer and you're less privileged than those who know how to play the cultural games. And he reckons then that privilege and class are reproduced through something called habitus, which I'll explain a little bit more. But basically, if you think about an animal living in a habitat, he has a similar idea to humans living in a habitus, where in the habitus we learn particular ways of living and being, and it cultivates our taste, not just taste for food, but taste for other cultural activities like going to the ballet or going to the football. So it's reproduced by the particular habitus that we're raised in, and then reproduced by other institutions like schools, like university, for example, art galleries and museums, where you'll find legitimate artefacts and cultural activities. So they've been legitimised. Three key ideas that he has is one of cultural capital, and the idea of capital is that he's kind of thinking of that in the same way that we might think of money, as an asset, as a resource that we can use. So it's a metaphor. The next one is field. I'll go into each of these, and the idea of social and cultural reproduction. What he found was that those in French society who were schooled in what he calls the legitimate culture, and I guess there he's thinking in terms of high culture back then, in terms of going to the opera, going to the ballet, listening to classical music was kind of high culture of those times. He reckons that those people who were schooled in that had certain privileges that others didn't. And that's what he calls cultural capital. And he reckoned there was a divide between that high culture of the ballet, the opera, classical music, and what was more popular. Some people have called it mass culture, so kind of everything else, watching television, going to particular theatre, going to the football, sport, things like that. Those who were versed in the high culture, who knew, and literature, opera, classical music, had more cultural capital than those who didn't. So that was one observation that he made. And he also noticed this thing that he calls an aesthetic disposition. I put this quote up there as an example of his writing, which really actually irritates me, because he puts so much into one sentence that it takes some time to pack it down. But we'll go through it. An aesthetic disposition is a generalised capacity to neutralise ordinary urgencies and to bracket off practical ends. So we don't need to be practical if we've got an aesthetic disposition. It's a durable inclination and aptitude for practice without a practical function. So we can do things like play a flute just for the pleasure of it, not in order to get a job, for example. And we can do that within an experience of the world that's freed from urgency and through the practice of activities which are an end in themselves, such as scholastic exercises or the contemplation of works of art. So what he's really saying there is that people who have this aesthetic disposition don't have the need, the urgency to go and make money or to play the flute in order to get a job in an orchestra. They're able to undertake these activities because they have sufficient resources to do these things for leisure. He then has this idea of field. So again, this is a metaphor that he's using. So he's thinking about playing games, and he's thinking about a football field, a soccer field or whatever, a sporting field. And he uses that metaphor of a field for a whole lot of different cultural areas as well. So if you think about the world of literature, he would call that the field of literature. The same with music, it would refer to that as a field. So all of these cultural fields have their own way of doing things, their own autonomy, and they can be understood by the way in which it all happens within a particular field. So the dynamics within it. So you'll have star players on a football field, you'll also have star players, opera singers for example, you'll have a range of people in that field, and you'll have a whole lot of people who are kind of excluded from it because they don't play as well as the others on the field. Even though these fields are all different in many ways, he reckons there's some similar principles that can be found across different fields. So sociology, for example, is regarded as a field of knowledge. So in general, the fields involve the polarisations of those who are considered part of it and those who are outside. So if you're outside the field, you're an outsider. You're not part of the club, part of what's going on. That's important. We've got a couple of ideas there. The idea that you've got some resources or an asset if you know how to engage in high culture, and the idea that all of these cultural activities that people engage in are referred to as fields. And he uses a metaphor of playing games on fields. When it comes to this idea of social or cultural reproduction that he's interested in, he reckons that we inherit all of our ways of being, our experience, our perceptions of the world. We inherit those through our family's habitus. And I'll go into that a little bit more, but if we come from a working class background, that habitus is quite different from somebody who lives in an upper class background. So we inherit our taste in that way. Taste for lifestyle, taste for food even, taste for clothing, depending on our family situation. And then we reproduce that through our own behaviour as well. So we do a similar thing when we have children, we teach them similar things to what we've grown up with. That differences in habitus is also passed down through school and education. So if you go to a school where they don't have a lot of funds, and they might not bring students into the art gallery very often, not see it as a regular sort of activity, that particular habitus won't get used to art, etc. Whereas if you are in a city school, perhaps you go to the art gallery every day or have a lot of that in your curriculum. So what he reckons, this is another one of his long sentences, is what he's saying here is that being the product of the conditionings associated with a particular class, it unites all of those in that particular class. So you have similar tastes, similar interests, and therefore you have a sense of affinity, I guess, with people. And so sometimes it can feel a bit odd. You might feel as if you're out of place with a particular group of people, and that can be because you come from a different habitus. He reckons that the winners keep tending to win and the losers keep tending to lose. So fields, he says, are really, it's his metaphor for a social structure, the social differentiation, the positioning of people on a particular field. And we can extend the metaphor of field beyond culture to things like politics, education, etc. And there are games played within and between each of the fields at the different levels within them. Most of the game playing we do is at the level of practical consciousness, which means we're on automatic pilot. We're not aware that we're playing a game. None of you will remember learning to walk. We don't usually think about that until such time as, unless we've had an accident, we have to relearn it. So we walk according to something that sociologists call practical consciousness. Same when you learn to drive a car. For a while there, you have to do that consciously, and then it slips into practical consciousness and you can be daydreaming or doing something else while you're driving a car. It's the same with this game playing that we do in these fields. According to Bourdieu, we're not really consciously aware of it at all until we do a class like this, and then suddenly we might become aware of it. And then our habitus or subjectivity informs our trajectory. So those who already have an advantage, the upper class advantage, in that they've learnt high culture already, they've gone to schools that have reproduced that and encouraged that, already speak right, look right, wear the right clothes, so they already have an advantage in society. is what he's saying. In terms of his empirical evidence as well, what he maintained was that those at the top of French society came from the upper class, and those at the bottom came from working class. So in other words, that's why he was interested that at a time of aristocracy, when even though the aristocracy was overturned, it was kind of replaced by the upper classes or another form of aristocracy. So what he says is that our taste in everything, our taste in food, our taste in clothes, our taste in movies, in games that we might play, all of that do not arise from innate, doesn't come from within us or individual preferences. What he actually says is that's related to our class and our habitus and our training in particular, the way in which we've been raised within that habitus, which would also include school. Moreover, the objects of our taste carry some sort of symbolic meaning. And so when we are wearing particular clothes or eating particular food, we are letting people know where we stand in the social order, in effect. So we're broadcasting that. So I thought, show you this little clip from Upper Middle Bogan. I don't know whether anyone's seen that show from a few years back. You'll see this idea of different habitus really clearly in just a minute of advertising of this particular show, which again I'd recommend for the contrast between two family situations.
Honey, I'm going to have to get up.
Oh, wow.
Happy birthday to you. Nanny Margaret.
Happy birthday, my darling.
Nanny, thank you. Subscription to the ballet. Mum? Mum? Hang on. We don't have the same blood type.
They've got it mixed up.
You've never been to hospital. Not even to have me. You're not my mother.
I wonder who they are.
Who?
My parents.
It's one Amy called Bess. She was born on April 11th. It's her, it's Janice. She's a doctor.
Mum, she can look at your knee and Kane's head.
Oh,
It's my reflux.
is that what you call her?
It's not my fault. I get fucking reflux. I just want them to like.
So the idea with that show is that she's raised in one particular fairly upper class environment, certainly upper middle class environment, I should say, and then she comes across the fact that she's adopted and she meets her birth family and they're Bogans. And so it's I think it's quite well done because it's done quite affectionately and makes fun of both groups of people, doesn't privilege one over the other, but certainly shows the contrast of growing up in different environments. So if you're interested in this sort of thing, then I'd encourage at least the first series. It got a bit silly after that. Anyway, the crux of the matter, according to Bourdieu, is that those who possess large amounts of money, economic capital, and cultural capital, or better, both, are actually dominant in French society, and then seek to impose their tastes on those who are less dominant. And so we have, even in that language of highbrow or high culture, suggests that it's better than popular or mass or low culture. That becomes what we call normative, the way that we should be. In this metaphor that he's got, just to go through that, so economic capital he uses, that's just money. In terms of social capital, that's about the friends you know. So everybody has friends, everybody has a network of friends, but it's a different network of friends at the bottom of the social structure than it is at the top of the social structure. So if you're at the top of the social structure and you're doing law, then your family may well know somebody who heads up a law practice, and you can just go and get a job like that. Whereas if you've done law and you come from a family where they don't have those connections, you're not going to get a job just like that easily. So cultural capital is the knowledge of what is legitimate or what is seen as valid, what is validated in French culture. And that's embodied. It is about the way that we dress, the way that we speak. And I've got an example there of a woman called Susan Boyle who won a competition in the UK a few years ago. She came from a very, very poor background. She was in her 40s, she was unemployed at the time. She walked out, she was kind of laughed at because she said she was going to sing an opera. And she did, and they couldn't believe it because what she sang, high culture, did not fit her appearance of low culture. So it's embodied. The idea of cultural capital is about the way that we dress as well. It's also institutionalised, of course, in terms of education, and one of the ways in which to gain cultural capital, of course, is to get a university education. And it's also, of course, objectified. It is displayed through what we own. And there's another sort of capital which is symbolic capital. So this woman, Rosie Batty, was doing lots of work around domestic violence. She was quite an advocate for a long period of time. Her work and advocacy didn't carry much symbolic weight. It wasn't recognised, it wasn't legitimised until she was the 2015 Australian of the Year, and that kind of changed everything. It gave her a lot more clout in the Australian community. What he reckons is that there's classes and then there's fractions of classes. There's the dominant and there's the dominated. And he reckons that there's kind of sometimes a symmetrical working out between economic capital and cultural capital, and sometimes it's asymmetrical. He reckons that there's a symmetry between the professions where there's a very high income and also high cultural capital. But when it comes to teachers, teachers have very high cultural capital, but they don't have as much money as some of the other professions. And think law, teachers don't earn anywhere near as much as well-paid lawyers. And the same happens with somebody who might be an industrial employer, somebody who owns, a mining company, for example. And Gina Reinhardt comes to mind, that she has bags of money, but not actually very much cultural capital. So there's an asymmetry there. So I just show this on this little map that I've done. So high cultural capital, low economic capital, they don't necessarily go together. So the professions will have high economic capital and high cultural capital, but industrial and commercial employers won't have high cultural capital necessarily, but they'll have a lot of money. At the bottom end, you could have teachers who have high cultural capital, not necessarily a lot of money, not a lot of economic capital, but you could have factory workers who don't have a lot of money and don't have a lot of cultural capital either. He says taste functions as a marker of class, not something that we talk a lot about in Australia. It's about our taste in food, art, what we read, whether we watch or play a sport, our housing, at the sort of furnishings that we have, our clothes. All of that reflects a habitus. It's not innate, it doesn't come from within us, it's acquired. And there's a hierarchy in it. If you think about literature, there's a whole genre called literature, and then there's popular books. And they might make a lot of money, but they're not necessarily highly regarded as literature. So there's always a hierarchy. And the value of something depends on the social mark that's attached to it, the amount of prestige that's attached to it. So there was a time in Chinese history where people flooded to get a university education, and then the value of that university education declined. So prestige is often associated with not much of as well. Our profit, whether we benefit from our cultural capital, depends on how competent we are at playing the game. And the paradox, and I really quite like this paradox, it's actually impossible to know, he says, if what's regarded as distinguished is distinguished because it's dominant, or dominant because it appears to have the desired qualities. So we don't really know how good something is. If there's a dominance factor associated, it might not actually be very good. It's just because it's dominant that we think it is very good. It says objectively and subjectively, aesthetic stances adopted in matters like cosmetics, clothing, home decoration are opportunities to experience or assert one's position in social space as a rank to be upheld or a distance to be kept. So we're saying something about where we're positioned in society with our taste. The dominant groups, he reckons, favour invisible acquisition. So they learn culture at home, going to concerts, reading the classics in literature. That all happens kind of organically, really. Manners are instilled from birth. It's really quite an important thing. There's a whole literature and history on that. And antiques, things like antiques and art, are handed down from generation to generation. So it's almost invisible. It is all just happening. Then there are experts who act as intermediaries between the classes. And what comes to mind, we used to have these charm schools for working class girls who would learn how to walk and talk and put books on their heads so that they could walk right and so that they could do that transition from one habitus to another habitus. And then he reckons there's this thing about symbolic integration of the dominated classes, so that it's the dominated class, it is the professions who impose their ideas. So they have desire for slim bodies, for example, so the magazines will all produce this ideal of a slim body as the way it becomes normative. So we can learn this as well. It's not necessarily invisible. That's what happens in the upper classes. But we can also learn that process through magazines, etc., or going to schools. For example, if you've got high economic capital and high cultural capital, then art is handed down. If you've come into a lot of money, you don't have a lot of cultural capital, then you can afford to go and buy art. And there's any number of people who do that. If you're a teacher, so you don't have a lot of money, but you do have a lot of cultural capital, you'll visit art galleries. And if you're a factory worker, and we're generalising a little bit, then what you'll do is go and get a tattoo. This idea of form versus function is important because it informs kind of tastes of luxury, where people who don't have, where money's not a problem, they're removed from necessity. They don't have to buy things or eat food that's going to keep them warm and generate enough calories, because they can just eat a salad, because that's not very important. They're not eating from necessity. Whereas the taste of necessity, where you're eating in order to keep yourself alive because you don't have a lot of money and you've got to spread your money through a week, is very different. That's a forced choice. You don't have a lot of choice over what you eat or what you're going to buy. Whereas if you have a lot of money, priority can be given not to necessity, but to form. So the shape of the body, the social form, the formality. Food doesn't, as I said, doesn't have to be filling, but it does have to be filling if you don't have a lot of money and you've got to, money has to stretch a very long way. So you can pay attention, if you can afford to do this, you can pay attention to the aesthetic function of clothing rather than just the practical function of clothing. Clothing doesn't have to just serve a practical purpose. It can be artistic and display all sorts of other things. And so somebody else has done this thing around food. So if you have low cultural capital, then you may eat food that's quite rich and salty, cheap, nourishing food that's going to keep you going for quite some time. Whereas if you're high cultural capital, then you're more likely to be concerned about your weight and maintaining a slim figure because that fits that particular normative model, and therefore you're more likely to eat natural or healthy foods and salads, etc. And an example here from a couple of shows that I've enjoyed in the past, like Downton Abbey, which is 19th century, where form over function, where very wealthy people, aristocratic people, could afford to sit around at dinner and somebody else does the work. That's not about food, that is about form, social gathering. It's not about, just filling up your body and servicing yourself in that way. And contrasted with a working class Australian show that we had for a while, Packed to the Rafters, where people just sat around the kitchen table. So very different form over function. And the difference between a deconstructed Greek salad and a Greek salad as well. I think that was on MasterChef one year. If we go between the high culture and the low culture, even if you've got money, so the issue here is about whether you've got cultural capital or not about whether you've got money or not. You're going to be sitting on this side of on one of these sides of the divide. So whether you've got cultured or close to nature, emphasis on form or an emphasis on function, whether you're buying clothes because they'll serve a need. Something's called high if it's got high cultural capital, low, vulgar, modest if it's low. The language that's used is usually fine or refined or elegant with high cultural capital, where it's more likely to be called coarse, heavy, fat on the other side. Something's light, sharp, witty, heavy, slow, thick. You're probably getting the point. Unique if it's on the high side, common if it's on the low side. Brilliant versus dull, obscure, mediocre. Bodies are tall and slim, or that's the desire, with high cultural capital. Bodies are short and stocky on the other side. Standardised English, so this kind of middle class English that we read at university, which actually nobody speaks, or versus a dialect. Women have very high status with high cultural capital, low on the other side. And what goes on with the high cultural capital side, his point is that's normative. That's the way that we're supposed to be because that's legitimate. Whereas on the other side, that's regarded as abnormal, freakish, wrong in some way. So in summary, what he's interested in is how this game is won. So he's curious about how it seems that the French society went from one aristocracy to an upper class who were kind of running the show. So how the game is won over and over again by the same groups of people. And he reckons the game is rigged. It's rigged. The dominant groups decide the rules and then not only expect everyone to agree with them, but they do. But everyone does agree with them. So we all think that we should have that tall, slim body. And his third point is that those marks of distinction, our consumption of particular cultural goods, e.g. particular food, show where we are in the social hierarchy. So that's the summary of what he says, but I just wanted to finish with some counters to what he says as well. His point about this social agent, so culture acting as a social agent. So what he reckons is that taste then becomes a social weapon. So if you have high cultural capital, you can whip that out and make somebody feel pretty small because they don't have the same sort of cultural capital that you do. So you can put them down, minimise them, dismiss them. It can be used as a weapon. Because it does that defining and distinguishing between the high from the low and what's legitimate, what's validated, what we all think we should be, rather than illegitimate. And it does that in relation to a whole lot of ways in terms of food, drink, cosmetics, clothes that we wear, art that we see. The main criticisms of his work are fairly recent. So he's been around for a while, very popular in Australia from the 1990s and still popular. The criticisms are that his idea of cultural reproduction is too deterministic. You know, if you've got those same groups winning over and over again, how can we have this idea of social mobility? And we do have a mobility. It's true that we have examples of people who come from extraordinarily poor backgrounds and end up in prominent positions. And that's the point there. It's overly deterministic, meaning this is the way that it has to be, whereas we can all find examples where it doesn't have to be that way at all. So it doesn't account for that upward mobility, and it doesn't account for upward mobility through education too. And we have a large pool of people coming from all walks of life at university. The other criticism is that those cultural divisions are less marked in Australia than they were in France, possibly still are in France, from what people tell me, still are in England. So where there's a very class-divided society, perhaps that works. In Australia, where we've always been perhaps a little less divided by class, keen to hear a view on that, maybe it doesn't quite work. So that's one of the criticisms of his work. The distinctions between high and lowbrow is too simplistic as well. Lots of people just think that opera no longer is highbrow, it's just not relevant anymore. And so it's too simplistic to have those distinctions between one form of art and another form. And those distinctions between different forms of art have been challenged a lot as well. And the other idea is that neoliberalism, or the particular sort of political economy that we're in at the moment, which emphasises the individual and individual responsibility, means that consumption has become diversified and fragmented. So we're all doing something different, is kind of the point to that we don't necessarily stick to what, even if we don't necessarily stick to what we've grown up with. We might be off and doing something else. And identity is such a big thing these days that we work to construct a particular identity. So class has been a little bit blown out of the water. This man called Herbert Gaines on popular culture. He was kind of popular around the same time as Bourdieu. He reckons that in fact you can't call something popular culture anyway. There's no such thing because it's a diverse range of activities and a diverse range of tastes. And he said that name actually came as an alternative to this mass cultural theory, which was always seen as commercial, and because it was commercial, it was seen as inferior to high culture, but it was kind of a little bit snobby, and many academics played into that as well. And his point also is valid, that popular culture appeals to a wide range of people right across the social spectrum as well. So we're not as divided on entertainment or in those nice clear class lines as Bourdieu was arguing. And Gaines was saying that popular culture should be seen as a legitimate taste culture that serves a significant purpose, and I would argue that these days it does. It is regarded as legitimate, even if it wasn't back in Bourdieu's time. But that has all changed quite significantly. And just a couple of other contemporary responses. The omnivore thesis, which appears in your writing in the readings this week, cultural mobility, and the voraciousness theory. With the omnivore theory, the idea is now that we have a range of cultural tastes. So even if, say, we grow up going to the opera, to the ballet, reading literature, that might not be all we do. And in Australia, that's quite marked when you think about something like the football, where that covers a vast range of people who like that, or cricket, those sort of sporting events cater to an enormous range of people from different backgrounds. So these days, this theory says that we don't have to stick rigidly anymore. We do have a wide range of tastes. The other point that is made is that high class is now becoming less highbrow and more appreciative of a range of tastes as well. So people who are listening to opera or whatever, that might not be all that they're doing. So we do have a broad engagement with different taste cultures from different television shows, music, etc. And so this omnivore thesis argues that snobbery is actually being undermined these days because we can engage in a wide range of activities and because popular culture has been legitimised. Emerson's theory of cultural mobility is important too. So social mobility means that you move from, say, working class background to upper class culture through education or through marriage. You can do it in a number of different ways. But cultural mobility is slightly different. It means that you can move around the cultural sphere, taking in something like high culture, as well as going to the football, as well as reading a trashy novel when you're on the plane. So taking in a whole range of cultural activities. And I should just go trashy, because I don't think anything is particularly trashy. But what Emerson's saying is that class still matters, and that's what we're going to be talking about in class this week. It's really interesting, isn't it, that we talk about social class, which relates to money and stuff, and then we have classes in school and at university. His other point is that mobility leads to privilege. The more mobile we are across the cultural fields, the more privilege that we have. And in order to be mobile, you actually need to be part of the upper classes. You need to be part of, and what he's talking about in his article is that it is the people who are in the management classes and the professions who are culturally mobile. And it probably takes a degree of economic capital as well to be really culturally mobile, because it costs money. He makes this other point too, which is worth thinking about, that it's not that high-class individuals like lowbrow, but more that they use their knowledge of it strategically. So if you're a guy who wants to develop a relationship with somebody from a different class, and you're a professional, wear a suit most of the time, but if you bump into somebody who's got high-vis gear on, You could probably talk football and bridge that gap. Now, you might not actually like football, is the point Emerson is making. You're using it strategically to build a relationship with someone else. Those people who do more these days are more distinguished. So in the time of the aristocracy, the 17th century France, the aristocracy were famous for not having to do a thing. They had servants, they didn't have to do anything. They could sit around and learn to play the flute. There was no need for them to do anything at all. What some academics argue today is that distinction comes from busyness. So the busier you are signals the high status that you have. And therefore, the busier you are at work, the more likely you're going to have this sort of leisure density at home. You're more likely to engage in a whole lot of cultural activities. And the higher the job status, the more heightened this voraciousness that you're going to consume a lot of cultural activities because you have limited leisure, and that's how you get a bit of relaxation. But the point, a part of the point of this is that busyness equals high status these days, whereas in the past, high status equaled leisure. And just to finish off, the theories that I've just mentioned, and we'll talk a little bit more in class, they do problematise that whole idea of high and low culture, high and low class. And I think we should think about that in terms of the language and whether we're perpetrating that if we say something is high culture. They question whether there still is an aesthetic that is associated with high class. So if you do have more money, a lot more social capital, a lot more economic capital, is there something in particular that you like culturally anymore, or is it more an idea of cultural mobility that you have a great deal of diversity in your tastes? And the other point is that those counters to Bourdieu really are generated from contemporary research, usually qualitative research, where people go and talk to people, maybe some surveys as well, and you might see some of those done with the ABC. And so it's a different time and a different place, and that's what I want us to be thinking about some more in class as well.